I am deeply interested in photography, so I thought it would be a really good idea to research different photography tips and techniques. And I found this really interesting website where it has 20 different techniques of photography, and I'm looking forward to going through it really. So the first technique is high speed photography, and I think I've done this once, maybe not. I'm not too sure. I think I did it on my phone, um, but what you need to do for kind of high speed photography is that you need quite like narrow aperture. So that means like the hole needs to be small, if that makes sense, in the lens. And also a tripod to make it steady as well. I think it's a really cool effect, and I'd love to try it one day. But my kind of photography is kind of portrait fashion photography, but I'd really like to try that. Night photography is obviously night photography, but because it's dark, you can the best way to kind of capture night photography is if you're in like a busy town or city with a lot of lights in it, because it's quite difficult because there's no sun or natural sunlight to light the photo up. So you kind of have to work out your ISO and your exposure with night photography. So it's a little bit difficult, but it's still a cool effect. So motion blur photography is mostly used in kind of sport photography. So if someone's running on a track, then you'll normally see motion blur there, as it's a really, really cool effect. And with motion photography, you have to keep your kind of subject in focus, and you have to try and keep the background, blurred. Like with this photo here is a really good example. You have to make sure that the shutter speed is slowed down slightly to create this effect. With black and white photography, I've done it a lot before, and it's a really cool effect as it feels a lot more kind of documentary style, and it's still very classy. And I think with black and white photography, it's got a very timeless effect on it, which I really, really like. I think I could maybe use this effect in future projects, and I think it's a really cool kind of effect to use if you're going to do documentary style. In my Strangely Familiar kind of series for Bristol, I took different pictures of pubs, but it was almost like I was doing a portrait of the pub, and then I did black and white photography to make it feel like a more documentary style photography, which I found really effective and interesting. So with macro photography, you can see the minute details of the subject in question, such as a flower or an insect, or a spider, like in this photo. And you need to have a very good kind of lens for it, really. As the best way for macro is that it needs to be kind of detailed, like the subject in question. So it really, really works well with that. I have done long exposure photography before. I've done it with my group of friends, and I've also done it kind of with doing it car trails as well. And it's really, really worked. And I really like long exposure. It's a lot of fun. And I think it can really kind of be experimented with, like with light exposure, kind of light painting, and with cars. And it's just really, really interesting, and I really do love long exposure. So I've also done panoramic photograph as well, in another series of photos about where I live. And I've also done it in another time, I think, as it's a different setting on my phone, and that's the only reason why I can kind of use it. I'd like to research panoramic photography a bit more, kind of what kind of lens would you need to use it and stuff like that, as I think it's a really interesting kind of view on it, really, because it's almost like you're seeing it with your own eyes, if that makes sense, which I really like about it. I'd really like to try vintage photography. So this means that you'd use film for photography. And I think when I go to university, I'm going to try this technique a lot more, as there's no kind of accessible dark rooms in college, or anywhere that I know of really in Cumbria. I'm sure that there will be, but also film can be a little bit expensive. But because there are more kind of accessible stuff in kind of unis and stuff like that, with dark rooms and so on, with chemicals and stuff like that, I think it'll be a really, really interesting kind of technique to look at. I'd also really love to try pinhole photography, as I've tried it before with a group of friends, but it didn't really work out. And I'd love to try it again. And in my kind of history timeline of photography, it's really the foundation of kind of photography, really. So a pinhole kind of camera, and I quote, is a simple camera with no lens and a single small aperture. So this means that light passes through this like little hole, and then it kind of makes the pictures basically. And I think that by making a pinhole camera, you'll need like some kind of like an old lens cap or something like that, and then you need to like drill a hole in it, maybe, I think. So I think I'm going to try and do that again maybe for my photography techniques, but I think it sounds like a really cool idea. So I've picked kind of my favourite ones out of these photography techniques. At the moment, I really love portrait and fashion photography, mostly because I find people really interesting and clothes as well. But I also really do like landscape photography and kind of different subjects like animals and so on. And I definitely love light as well. But so far, I think black and white and possibly long exposure is probably my favourite. So that's kind of my favourite photography technique so far.